Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to an introduction to Structured Enquiry. This video is to give you some more information about what Structured Enquiry is and provide some ideas and strategies for implementing it in your classrooms. My name is Dianne Blackburn. I'm an IB educator and I've had the privilege of working with the Lee Academies Trust for quite some time now, exploring different areas of pedagogy and supporting the implementation of IB programs within the different schools. Okay, so we're going to think a little bit about what is inquiry and also what inquiry isn't. Inquiry-based learning is primarily a pedagogical method. This was developed in the 1960s and it was kind of a reaction to looking at different ways of instructing students that didn't rely purely on memorizing information and recall. It's rooted in these constructivist learning theories where we're actually building on prior knowledge and learning how to learn. Inquiry also explores the concepts. So in our programs, we have concepts which we use and we look at engaging the students in content and material, but providing a process where we are supporting their questioning and investigating and also, of course, collaborating. And this helps them to make meaning about the learning and the content and also the world around them. So exploring outside of our classrooms also. So the inquiry teacher has a reputation perhaps or an image in mind of someone who's kind of sort of allowing students to in the classroom be running around the classroom perhaps, or just not being in control of a classroom and a chaotic classroom. But actually inquiry teachers are more around provoking questions. They're modeling inquiry themselves, so they're asking questions themselves, and they're also valuing the curiosity that is evident in all of our students. They explicitly teach students skills, some skills which are really important, of course, these approaches to learning skills, such as collaboration and inquiry through critical thinking as they investigate problems and different projects. Inquiry teachers do plan thoroughly. They are very, very familiar with their content and they facilitate the learning. But also they're sometimes prepared to release themselves from a plan and take a different path as their students are inquiring and perhaps investigating in areas that our teachers perhaps hadn't thought about. And this is part of what's really exciting about being an inquiry teacher, not letting go of the learning, not letting go of the support and control of their classroom, but actually going on a learning journey often with our students. Through inquiry, we're really facilitating and encouraging curiosity and trying to trigger that in our students. And you'll see here on the slide, we're talking about these critical thinking skills, which are just so important for our learners, both in the classroom and beyond the classroom in their later life. It's looking for things that ignite a child's passion and makes them excited and makes them drive and want to learn. So in our inquiry classrooms, we're part of the learning journey with the students, but also we're encouraging that passion for learning and enabling them to have some agency over that learning themselves as well. We hope that inquiry-based learning ignites a love of learning which will last a lifetime. I think all educators who are continually developing their strategies are all lifelong learners, and igniting our students with that passion is certainly something that I really support and hope and encourage that you'll be able to do with your students. So thinking about inquiry in our school allows us to think about how we can connect the school and connect what we're doing in our classrooms with not just the local community, but also the global community, and thinking about how we can use some of these contexts as a way of connecting with the learning and investigating what is happening around us. So really using real world examples in our inquiry classrooms. We can think about, for example, there's a couple of examples here on the screen about perhaps designing and growing a sustainable garden and using a lot of our skills in our subject areas around the sciences or maths, for example, and then perhaps something more apparent and more relevant to some of the issues that we might have in our very locale, perhaps something like parking issues in a staff car park. There really are no ends to the ways that we can connect the learning to what is happening locally, but of course globally. We want to encourage our students to really inquire into things that matter to them, and thinking about inquiry-based learning, we're able to encourage this and encourage that shared guardianship of the planet, and also, you know, concern and relevance in understanding what's happening within our local area, and thinking perhaps more about the learner profile and how those attributes are really important to our students as they have caring and empathy towards what is happening around them. This helps to make learning really relevant to our students, and they can understand why they are learning. So thinking about what's happening in the world around them and connecting that to their learning really has relevance, and really solidifies that understanding of the importance of learning particular skills within a wide variety, of course, of their subject areas. So something which is really interesting, I love this poster. It talks about classroom rules and thinking about being ready to learn and dreaming big, and those sort of areas about, you know, that just the politeness of our students saying please and thank you. But my absolute favourite part of this poster is about being risk takers and making mistakes. And really in the inquiry classroom, that's something which is so important, because our students need to be able to feel comfortable to make mistakes. They need to feel comfortable to get things wrong, and thinking about our learner profile attributes, but also our approaches to learning skills, being able to sort of bounce back and to discover new ways of understanding and connecting with the content and also their learning. So encouraging them not to be afraid of making mistakes, and to actually encourage that to be something that they try to do, you know, working hard, believing in themselves, but also exploring areas that might be, you know, might be a challenge, and it might be an avenue that they'll go down where they need to reevaluate, reflect, and come back and start the learning process again. This is something that builds, of course, resilience and those effective skills in our students. Within this slide also, what I really like to highlight is just thinking about our students and how we encourage in the classroom them to be mindful and caring for each other, to be able to really explore ideas and to share out thoughts, and to, you know, take time to internalize information, and allowing our students to really feel comfortable in that exploration is so important. Those of you who perhaps done a workshop with me will know that we always start with the essential agreements in our learning environment, so that we can ensure that everyone in that environment feels comfortable. And this is something that I would encourage you to do with your students in your inquiry classrooms. Ask them what would make their learning environment comfortable, and things like there being no silly questions and it's okay to make mistakes might be some of those areas that students might contribute to in those essential agreements. So setting that as a foundation in the classroom is supremely important, I think, to have authentic inquiry happening and to allow students to really explore within that context. So we want to empower our students. Some see inquiry-based learning as a departure from the curriculum, but actually really we're through structured inquiry, we're really exploring the curriculum, we're exploring the content, we're exploring the learning, but we're doing so through questioning, asking our students to develop their own questions, to set some questions for them, and actually allow them to ask questions of each other. This really empowers them to take ownership of their learning and allows them to develop their own learning strategies. Again, reflecting back to approaches to learning skills, I think it's really important to allow our students to think critically and to research and to sometimes explicitly teach these areas, but also to then use these as strategies for our students' development in the structured inquiry. Now, differentiation is something which quite often we will set several different strategies to be able to support a variety of learners. Through inquiry-based learning, it's really the natural differentiator. It allows our students to really think about where they connect with the learning. We don't pre-assume a level that a student will get to. It actually allows the students to be able to develop their own learning, their own strategies, and it really works with a diverse learning styles of our students. It really allows us to empower students to explore their own learning and to really find their own process quite often. It allows us to think about delivering a range of content, and perhaps a variety of ways to process it, thinking about the students' distinct learning needs and preferences. So some of this we can front load by thinking about the types of learners that are coming into the classroom, but then providing them with a variety of ways to inquire allows them to really take some agency over that. We're not letting go, we're not stepping back and putting our hands by our sides and saying off you go and learn, but what we're doing is providing lots of different strategies for them and really facilitating and supporting them on that learning journey. So I've got a little video here for you, and what I want you to think about is how this really supports allowing our students to look at the world differently, and perhaps wonder what questions students might ask after they've experienced this classroom.
Today we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare. I know a lot of you look forward to this about as much as you look forward to root canal work. We're going to talk about Shakespeare as someone who writes something very interesting. Now, many of you have seen Shakespeare
done very much like this. "O Titus, bring your friend hither."
But if any of you have seen Mr. Marlon Brando...
No, but Shakespeare can be different. France, Romans, countrymen. Let me read.
You can also imagine maybe John Wayne as Macbeth going, "Well, is this a dagger I see before me?" Why do I stand up here? Anybody?
To feel taller.
No. Thank you for playing, Mr. Dalton. I stand upon my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. See, the world looks very different from up here. You don't believe me? Come see for yourselves. Come on. Come on. Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try. Now, when you read, don't just consider what the author thinks. Consider what you think. Boys, you must strive to find your own voice. Because the longer you wait to begin, the less likely you are to find it at all. Thoreau said most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Don't be resigned to that. Break out. Now, don't just walk off the edge like lemmings. Look around you. There you go, Mr. Christie. Thank you. Yes. Dare to strike out and find new ground.
Okay, so that video really, for me, really solidifies thinking about how we can encourage our students to ask questions, how we can ask them to look at things differently and find new ways to inquire into the learning, and encouraging them to do that through structured inquiry enables them to really delve much deeper into the learning and thinking about how our learners in that example would be able to delve into the learning, thinking about Shakespeare and how different perspectives from different actors might bring different opinions and views. So just thinking about that as a way of thinking about the questions that those students might ask afterwards. I'd ask you to reflect on that after we've finished our video today. Okay, so thinking about the big idea, the conceptual understanding. So within our programs, we have these concepts that we work with, and what we want our students to do is to take away from any piece of work that we do with them, learning which will last with them for a long time, perhaps a lifetime. And by allowing them to inquire into the big ideas behind that learning, that really enables our students to be able to really connect quite deeply with the learning and the big ideas. So thinking about those concepts, how will we ask our students to inquire into the concepts as we're designing our learning, designing our units of work, and designing our strategies? So structured inquiry is rather than being something that is done and a process that we follow and the ABCs of it, think about it more as a framework. Structured inquiry is the most easy inquiry framework to embed within a curriculum. So if you have a precise curriculum and precise content, what we can do is, through that framework, just enable questioning to happen at particular points, and just encourage our students to ask questions and to use those questions to really dive further into their learning. So thinking more about the framework rather than a process that has to be done explicitly step by step. So why inquiry? Why does it work? Why is it beneficial for our students? Well, an inquiry-based curriculum develops those ATLs, which I've already mentioned, and characterises a lifelong learner, which is of course central to the IB mission and vision. Perhaps have a look at the IB mission statement and think where you can see inquiry within there. You will see how we are encouraging our students to be lifelong learners and encouraging them to inquire and understand the world around them. So it connects quite explicitly with that. We're asking our students to pose difficult questions and to think about the skills that they need to acquire knowledge, but also knowledge that is about the world, not just knowledge that is within a curriculum, but within connecting to the outside world, and really doing that through structured inquiry is going to allow our students, as I mentioned earlier, to really connect their learning to their local context, their global context, and really understand why it matters to them. Students are given some ownership of their learning. It's not a case of standing back and just saying, off you go and inquire. It's about allowing students to have some agency and to actually be able to voice how they like to learn and how they like to connect to learning. And this is something that through doing structured inquiry, we can start to build some of these skills with our students, and take time to really think about how this might impact them in the future. So when they've left our programs, our primary programs or our middle years programs, and perhaps gone on to hopefully to university or college, these skills will stay with them, and it allows them to actually be able to connect with their learning in most college or even professional settings. Thinking about an inquiry-based approach allows students to think about the academic content and how that impacts their own lives. Now, for some of our schools, we have really quite culturally diverse or linguistically diverse learners. And actually through inquiry, we can actually really help them to connect and understand why this might matter to them, why this learning might matter to them. And actually allowing for some choice there is really important. So thinking about allowing our students to really come into the classroom with an opportunity to talk about their own context, and their own different culture, and their own different language perhaps. This really empowers our students to be able to really connect with the learning. So I've mentioned our approaches to learning skills already. Now the IBL strengthens concepts and knowledge, and our structured inquiry approach really allows our students to really dive into that knowledge and to explore through the concepts. The student is involved in the problem and is encouraged to actually solve it. So we're not presenting students with a series of learning experiences. We're asking them to ask questions and then to come up with the solutions. It asks our students in that process to really explore creative thinking process. So again, thinking about our approaches to learning skills, we may need to take some time to actually teach our students to think creatively and use some strategies to really take ownership of that and understand that that's what they're doing. And this again is one of the strategies that we might want to put into place as we start to slowly implement structured inquiry in our classrooms. Of course, we're thinking about not what to think, but how to think. And this comes in with this metacognition of learning how to learn. So connecting our learners to the approaches to learning skills and thinking about that learning process and what works for them, what strategies work for them, will actually really also help to implement structured inquiry in our classrooms. We'd also like to think about perhaps the organisation of thoughts, but also note-taking and some of those own self-management skills, which will help our students to be able to effectively solve problems. So social and self-management are extremely important in an inquiry-based classroom. And again, quite often, some of these skills we either assume our students have, or we leave this to more of a tutor room or homeroom environment. But actually doing this through the lens of our different subject areas or different year groups, and doing this in the context of the curriculum, actually really helps learners to connect to the learning and connect to those approaches to learning skills. And of course, thinking about the transfer of knowledge and problem solving is incredibly important in our classrooms, and actually connecting learning from one subject area to another and thinking to previous learning environments by explicitly exploring this with our students and asking them to recall and think about other ways that they have learnt in other subjects really helps them to connect through the concepts and the context of learning and be able to, you know, use those to really fuel their own questioning and that approach to inquiry. Thinking about structured inquiry, so it focuses on the why and the how and not the what so much of knowing. So we're thinking about what is known and what perhaps isn't known. We're activating and motivating our learners, so really thinking about how we can really get them involved in that whole learning process. Building lifelong independent learners is essential to our IB programs, and by doing inquiry in our classrooms, our students are really getting an opportunity to connect to their learning and have some independency over that. And that really isn't something that we need to sort of wait until students reach a more mature age. They can do that at any stage because they're building up their inquiry practice as they're going through in different subject areas and different year groups, and just developing the skills slowly. Inquiry doesn't happen overnight, and often our students need to take a step back and actually learn how to ask questions depending on where they have come from previously. This might not be something that they've had an opportunity to do. They may have been in more of a sort of an environment where information was fed to them and they have to recall that. So it might be actually needing to develop those skills in our students. Again, we mentioned earlier about the environment for our classrooms and allowing it to be mistake making. We really also need it explicitly to encourage that risk taking, and that being something that quite often is something that students, depending on their context, especially with our teenagers, on their particular age or the day of the week, or whether they had an argument at home in the morning, it might be something that they don't feel comfortable to do. So actually explicitly sometimes teaching risk taking might be something which might be very beneficial for your classroom. So thinking about strategies to do that. Again, thinking about the learner profile here as well, respecting others and their opinions and understandings. And this again reflects back to the IB mission, where we understand others with their different contexts can also be right. So understanding those different learners and being open-minded to that, and different ways of us looking at a problem. So thinking back to Robin Williams there in that Seize the Day, and looking at those students, allowing them to all inquire in different ways and allowing them to all find different connections to the learning, and then sharing that out makes for a very rich experience. Thinking about flexibility and adaptive thinkers. Again, students will learn at different rates and different stages through different subject areas, and again that will be evident in how they are inquiring. In some subjects they may feel more confident and inquire more quickly and more deeply, and they may need further encouragement in other subject areas where this is less familiar for them. Again, inquiry allows for different learning styles, and really, as I mentioned in that earlier slide, it is the natural differentiator. So allowing our students to, to meet the learning in the style that they wish to, and how they particularly like to learn is really crucial in our inquiry classrooms. And finally, it shows that we are all learning, and I can't emphasize this enough. Really, as teachers and students, we are all on a learning journey, and one of the fears that many teachers have about having an inquiry-based classroom is that students will inquire into things that the teacher doesn't know the answer to. But actually that's okay. I mean, we're very, very strong in our content knowledge and our subject knowledge, but quite often students will venture down a path that is less familiar to us, and actually sort of working alongside them and working with them and exploring that path together is actually an extremely rich learning experience. So I'd really encourage you to really be open to that and to think about what possibilities that might bring to your classroom. So here we are. We're going to think just explicitly about the learner profile. It asks for inquiries, of course. We want to ask questions to learn and know more, but also thinking about the attribute of being a thinker. We need to consider so many wide ideas, a variety of ideas, and think about different strategies and different ways of learning. So actually enabling our students to develop that attribute explicitly will enable them to become stronger inquirers in our structured inquiry classrooms. Now, through inquiry, we also need to be a strong communicator where we listen and we share openly. So also thinking about listening to others and then sharing our ideas and feeling secure and confident in doing that. As I mentioned, being a risk taker is incredibly important, and really promoting our students to really try new things regardless of the outcome. And this reflects back to that mistake-making classroom, thinking about the process of going through structured inquiry and thinking of those stages and allowing our students to sometimes go down a path that might not have the correct outcome, but by learning through that process. Now, of course, our students need to be knowledgeable, and here we're thinking about them developing understandings from a variety of resources. So exploring and researching in different ways and pooling that knowledge and bringing that together. Again, being principled as a learner profile attribute, they need to be respectful of each other and fair, but also honest in their process. So really thinking about developing this attribute is really powerful in our inquiry classrooms, because it enables all of our students to feel comfortable in the process. Again, being caring of each other and compassionate and open to other ideas is essential within an inquiry classroom, as no ideas are silly and no questions are silly. Being open-minded allows our students to really explicitly consider different points of view, and it takes positive advantage of diversity. So really thinking about different perspectives, different viewpoints, coming together with maybe cultural or linguistic contexts which are diverse, really allows our students to learn more from that process. Being balanced, allowing our students to think about the value of work, play and rest. So being able to promote that within our classroom, to take some time to think, allow information to settle and to reflect on that process. And of course, here we have finally being reflective, being proactive learners that learn really from their successes, but also from their failures, and that being something that they feel comfortable with and are encouraged to do. Okay, so I've got another video for you here, and what I hope it tells you about a little bit about is thinking about inquiry, and it is not about the teacher abdicating responsibility. It's not about chaos. Students researching and investigating without a purpose or a path. We are thinking about structuring inquiry so that we're going on the learning journey with the students, and we're asking them to ask questions as they go. And in this video as well, you'll see that teacher is asking the questions and there is nothing coming back. So I think this is possibly a 180-degree difference to what I hope you consider your inquiry classrooms to be, but it's quite an amusing video, so just have a watch of this.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Okay, so quite an amusing video, but also thinking about those students in that classroom where they're not invited really to participate in the learning process. They're invited to respond to questions, but the questions don't pose any opportunity to inquire. It's recall. So perhaps those questions could have been posed in groups, and students could have discussed and collaborated and done some research. And this would have been a great spin on that particular lesson, but to make it really around structured inquiry. So the teacher knew exactly what the outcomes were going to be. The teacher had posed the questions, but was that allowing the students to explore those questions within the context of that classroom. And again, by being part of that learning process and that learning journey, that really enables students to connect with their learning. By participating, they remember far more than just by being passive on the side and just listening to information. So I wonder if you can think about how you could perhaps take some of those strategies I've just mentioned and put them into a classroom, one of your next lessons, perhaps just by changing some of the groupings, changing some of the processes in the classroom, and by perhaps having a question bank that you allow students to pull questions from and then perhaps add more of their own. So just a funny video, but think about some of the processes that we could perhaps put in place to really ensure that particular lesson had some really authentic structured inquiry within it. So we do need a knowledge base. It's really important to remember that students need to have a solid knowledge base to build on inquiry. It's not about students just coming in and knowing nothing and then going and inquiring and finding everything out and coming back. We quite often will need to build on, as the constructivist pedagogy talks about, build on prior knowledge, build on prior learning. Some of our lessons and teachings will be around core principles, and we will really need those to happen to ensure success. So allowing for, I would say, a foundation of learning in particular areas, particular topics. Your students will also need time to learn those key skills, such as the ATL skills around research, critical thinking, problem solving, and even some of that teamwork, collaborative practice. So by thinking in advance about some of the skills that your students might need, you can explicitly teach these particular skills with them, or collaborate with your colleagues and consider what has been taught elsewhere, and think about that transfer of knowledge to a different setting, transfer of skills to a different setting. Some of the skills, as I say, will require explicit instruction and then mastery to come practice with time. So if we were to take perhaps reflection, teaching our students to reflect at each stage of the learning process is really quite a powerful tool, because once they automatically reflect at each stage of the learning process, they can kind of formatively assess themselves and think about where their gaps in their understanding is, or perhaps where the gaps in how they're evidencing their understanding, and think about what they had missed out and go back and pull some of those areas together and then move forward. So this is an example of how we can really use explicit instruction of a skill to then become mastered and be part of everyday practice. And reflection, I think, as I say, is one of the most powerful ones, because it can work in every single learning setting and just become part of your students' normal learning process. I've popped 80-20 split onto this slide at the bottom, and there is a theory around inquiry-based learning that where we have, in the example in the previous slide, the teacher is standing at the front of the class and speaking to the students, and that might be a 100% process. The teacher is always at the front. In inquiry-based learning, we're thinking perhaps more working towards starting with less directed teacher instruction, and generally that becoming less and less and less as we become more an expert practitioner in inquiry-based instruction, but also our students become more expert as inquirers. So going for maybe 80% inquiry, 20% direct instruction might be something that we might be able to work towards to get that balance in the classroom. So 20% of that explicit direct instruction, where we're talking about developing a solid knowledge base, teaching some core principles, perhaps teaching skills explicitly, and then the 80% of the time allowing for that student inquiry to happen. And this doesn't happen sort of front loaded at the very beginning. This would be peppered through the learning process. So thinking about the next areas is what is an inquiry teacher? What kind of skills, what kind of practice should we have? And why we should perhaps change our current practice? How might it benefit us to really think about introducing structured inquiry into our classrooms? And then also thinking about there are different levels of inquiries and why we should perhaps focus on one particular area and use that really to be our focus for practice in our classrooms. So inquiry-based learning is characterised by the student-centred learning experience, and the instructor or the teacher does serve as a facilitator. So very often when I'm describing what an inquiry-based classroom might look like, you might see groups of students around the room working on perhaps different questions, different activities, different learning processes, and the teacher actually moving from group to group and supporting those learners. It might be that students are doing some pair work and the teacher has in advance just front-loaded some activities for them, and they're then exploring and sharing information and inquiring together. It's not that the teacher is just the guidance on the side. There is a lot of work that we do in advance, but during the inquiry classroom, we really are a member of that classroom, whether it's a physical or a virtual classroom. I mean, we've had experience of those virtual classrooms recently, and where inquiry-based learning has been really powerful has been in that kind of virtual environment where we haven't been able to connect explicitly with our learners, but we can certainly provide inquiry strategies and allow them to go and research and find those. So not just the guide on the side. I must emphasize that as much as I can. It really is about you facilitating the learning, moving from group to group, asking more questions and when students get perhaps stumped, and giving them an opportunity to really develop and advance their understanding. So students might be at different stages, which is why it's really a great natural differentiator. You might have grouped students together in different levels and abilities so that they can support and collaborate and work with each other, or you may have students grouped into different abilities with different types of questions to really facilitate their involvement in inquiry and going on to an inquiry journey together as a team. So I've now got a video by Kath Murdoch. Kath Murdoch's an Australian lady who is really well known for her blogs and her videos about inquiry-based learning. So here is a video where she talks about inquiry in the classroom.
Inquiry is something we all do every day. It's how people learn. We're born curious. We need that curiosity in order to survive, in order to make meaning. People are natural inquirers, and inquiry learning in the classroom, to a degree, builds on that, uses that to the teacher's advantage. Unfortunately, what happens still in many schools is that the classroom's almost like kryptonite to inquiry. Because kids often enter a classroom and in many ways they're asked to do the opposite of inquiry, to sit down, to be quiet, to dominantly listen, to answer teachers' questions rather than being invited to ask their own. That can have the effect then of diminishing that very natural hunger to find out. So inquiry as an approach from a teacher's perspective is designed to sustain, nurture and grow that natural disposition that we all have to find out, to be researchers, both internally and externally. We don't lose the ability unless we're put in situations where we don't have the drive, we don't have the motivation to want to find out. If all you're being asked to do is answer other people's questions, and when you've got no voice or no agency in your own learning, that diminishes your curiosity. You've got no drive to do that. There's no real purpose. Learners need purpose. We need a reason. We need problems to solve. We need questions of our own that we want to answer. I think at its essence, we've always known that as teachers we get the most engagement when kids are doing something that they see has value, has purpose, that they're fascinated by. And great inquiry teachers know how to create and design learning situations that are fascinating and purposeful and authentic, and also happen to meet curriculum agendas too. While it's a natural disposition to use it effectively as a learner, particularly in a digital, globally connected environment, we need a toolkit of skills and strategies to do that. And so there's a whole lot of stuff we can learn through school and with the right kind of guidance that makes us more and more and more skilled inquirers. So we've got that natural disposition, that's at our core, but then we build on that and actually learn how to use it to do more and more complex learning over time.
Okay, so just thinking about what Kath said there, one thing that we can do to really start some authentic inquiry in our classrooms is to start with a provocation. It might be that we start with a video, or perhaps a picture, or perhaps a poem, or perhaps a song, or an extract from a book. But starting with a provocation can often be a great hook to start inquiry. Placing that picture up on the wall and just saying to our students, what questions do you have about what you can see? And really allowing your students to then really start to ask those questions. For example, this is a great way of starting that inquiry process, because I mentioned earlier it is often quite difficult for students who are not experienced in inquiry to actually start to inquire and to think about asking questions. And from there we can then start to nurture those questions at different stages through the structured inquiry process. So this is another visual that I really, really love, and I hope that you find this really a clear visual for you. As we think about the different types of student inquiry, I remember being thrown in the deep end by my father into a swimming pool when I was a child, and having to sink or swim. Not the safest way of doing anything, and certainly not a great memory, if I'm really honest. But what we're thinking about here is structured inquiry as being student following the lead of the teacher as the entire class engages in one inquiry together, and actually starting to explore together. Explore and start to inquire and start to ask those questions. And then as our learners become more proficient and we become more proficient as inquiry teachers, we can then start to really process and become more controlled or guided. But what we're looking for in our context is some structured inquiry. So we're not doing this free inquiry at the end where students are coming in and choosing their own topic and there's no reference or prescribed outcome. We're really thinking about taking our wonderful curriculum and finding ways to in place structured inquiry, take that process, think about the learning process and how we can pepper that with some questions, pepper that with activities that will allow our students to use those ATL skills that we've taught them, and to actually start to research, inquire and question each other. So I hope this really illustrates for you what we are looking for right now. And here, thinking about the levels of inquiry-based learning and how our teacher involvement is there. We're thinking about a high level of teacher involvement. It really isn't this low level where the teacher is really maybe just starting at the very beginning with the students and then standing back and allowing them to open inquire. We're really thinking about high teacher involvement, allowing students to reinforce their prior knowledge and really following a very set process. So thinking about our planners and the curriculum model, in structured inquiry, learning teachers develop their lessons around a framework, and we all have a framework. It might be a national curriculum that we've adopted into a unit planning process, depending on our programme. But what questions do we need to ask about that plan that we have? Thinking about the purpose. What is the purpose? What do we want the outcomes to be? What do we want to learn? How will we know what we have learned? So thinking about those formative assessments and how we can build those towards perhaps a summative assessment. Thinking about how best we will learn, some of those skills and strategies that we need to really think about developing for our students, and ensuring that they will have the best opportunity to learn. What resources will we use? What resources might be available? What variety of resources? Will we have a range of resources that will allow our students to inquire into different areas? I remember creating a strategy with some students and some teachers around inquiry, and actually allowing the students to curate inquiry. How often do we go off and find a number of web pages or a number of books that we're going to prescribe for our students? By actually teaching our students in advance academic honesty and research skills, we can actually allow them to have more agency over their research and allow them to come back with lots of different examples that they've researched themselves. And then we can together curate those research examples and think which ones work well and which don't. And again, this is a really powerful learning experience for our students. Thinking here also about taking action, connecting to our real world. Will we allow our students within that process of learning to take any action, maybe around our around service, or maybe around some advocacy? So really thinking about if there might be some actions that we might need to take, our students might want to take. And then finally, thinking about reflecting on the learning process. To what extent did we achieve our purpose? And of course, reflection is an ongoing process, and I would really encourage you throughout the inquiry process to reflect at each stage, and encourage your learners to reflect at each stage. So thinking about our curriculum, the structure with structured inquiry allows us to successfully address the curriculum and the must-know content and skills of each discipline, grade level, no matter what the course. What we're doing is thinking about the learning objectives and thinking how we can unpack those with different resources to prepare learners for reaching a successful conclusion with a summative assessment and that assignment that will take them to the end of that module or that piece of work. We want them to be able to, everything they do within the structured inquiry, to respond to those questions that we had at the beginning or the statement, and actually go through a process reaching a successful conclusion in the assessment. Thinking more specifically about some of the areas of structured inquiry, it is inclusive by nature, because we're allowing our students to inquire in ways that appeal to them, but also to have some agency over that, taking advantage of the diversity of our learners. Again, as I've mentioned previously, we really must think about those approaches to learning skills and thinking about critical thinking and creative thinking for sure, and thinking about our students' inquiry and perhaps the service areas as well. Thinking about structured inquiry, it might change the focus from teaching through subjects to teaching through themes, to teaching through needs to understand. So perhaps pulling back from particular core topics and thinking along broader themes, and structured inquiry certainly allows us to connect across the subject areas as well, and I would really encourage that horizontal articulation to be developed in your year groups. I love this picture. This to me emphasises the process of structured inquiry, where we've got the teacher is leading the vehicle of learning, and we're all sort of passengers on the journey, but we are leading that learning. It really isn't very much talking about students taking over the driving of the vehicle, but very much the teacher is still driving the vehicle, and we are going on a learning journey together. When we're thinking about starting our structured inquiry process, I'd like you to take a moment to think about what that might feel like as a student, and to look through the lens of the learner when considering how you're going to really shape that classroom. Keep them at the heart of your decisions. Really think about the advantages of this for them. and think about how they might respond to that gradual increase in agency. What benefits will that have for your student? Certainly, in my experience, allowing learners to be part of their learning journey and giving them agency over that increases their engagement, increases their enthusiasm, and really develops an opportunity for lifelong learning, and that to stay with them really for the rest of their lives. So what does structured inquiry look like? Note down any changes you think you can see that that your students might benefit from this way of learning, but also what are the challenges? What might be challenging? This is a particular video which looks at quite a big project around structured inquiry, but what elements might you be able to take away and think about applying in your classroom right now? Okay.
This is still settling, but we found a lot of little organisms.
So cool. The real question we're trying to answer here is if it's safe to tube in the water, because I swim here every summer, and I just realized how dirty it was.
When we design a science lesson to be an inquiry-based lesson, we start everything around a central question that may last for one class period or a series of class periods. And then they work through some experiment and conversation, perhaps some reading, and they work together. And the answers are always just a little bit out of reach for the kids until they really reach a point where they have this sense of discovery. Each of you are gonna be in a group where you're gonna sample one parameter down at the creek. And then you're gonna make an infographic about your parameters. So for example, maybe it will be temperature and turbidity. And then ultimately, what you're going to have to decide in your final prompt is going to be answering this question. Would you recommend to your friends coming from out of town that they go tubing in Boulder Creek?
If you just ask a question and then gave the answer, it would be the same as if you just read the textbook. So we don't like to do that. We like to ask the question and then give a lot of different experiences, both through media, through discussion, through research, so kids can start to answer that question themselves.
When we actually go down to the creek, it's an exciting day for the kids. We've talked up the idea that we're really in an outdoor classroom. Let's find a spot and let's sit down and start working on our physical survey of the area, everybody. So you'll work on your map first. Suddenly they're looking at it through a different lens. They're looking at it through a lens as a place where we're now going to be doing some sampling and some scientific thinking. If the water appears clear, is it clean? And then if it's not clean, what does that mean?
Mr. Schwartz gave us bugs that can live in healthy water and bugs that can live in unhealthy water. Yeah. We're gonna find which bugs are we find in here, and if they're all in like unhealthy water bugs, then we're gonna like know that this is unhealthy water.
I think it's 5 ppm.
5 ppm, I think.
From what we found, there wasn't as much nitrate as we thought there would be.
We would still go swimming even though it seems pretty dirty, but we know that there's a lot of organisms in here, and that leads us to believe that it's actually pretty healthy.
And we spend the next class period sort of going through that data, and they put that into a poster, an infographic, where they can actually share with the class in a way that's relevant to the kids, something that's kind of flashy and interesting. What is the data that our group got? And then, what do we do with that data if we look at everyone's data together? So kids reach their conclusions a couple days after we do our sampling.
Because sometimes, like when you're just reading from a book, you don't really think about how this is actually real life and how it actually works.
We're working through some question together, and we're discovering things as we go. And kids always bring with them knowledge. And very often it turns out that the kids teach me a lot, and we're all sort of learning together.
Okay, so a couple of things that I take away from that are, my goodness, the risk assessment to be able to do a project like that might be too huge, or it might be needed to be planned way in advance, many months in advance. But allowing the students to actually connect with their local context brought their learning very much to life. So perhaps thinking about just one switch that we can make in the activities that we have, which might allow for that local or global connection to the real world, will enable our students to really have more understanding of why they are learning what they're learning and why it matters to them. And I really can't emphasize that part enough. So perhaps think about allowing students to connect in a way that meets something in their local community. And what would be a great way of starting this off is to ask them about some of the things that are happening in their local community and start to really learn from them about what matters to them. So what I'd like to emphasize at this point is to start small. Don't expect to be able to do a really, powerful structured inquiry, start to finish straight away. It takes time. It takes time for our learners, and it also takes time for us. We don't all become facilitators of inquiry overnight. It takes time, and quite often the difficult thing is just taking that first step. So perhaps start with something like the provocation. That might be a good way to start, or start with just creating an opportunity for our students to connect with something in their local area and start to think about how they can individually connect and work with something that matters to them. Also start with a unit that you'll love, something that you are passionate about, because that passion will come over in your teaching. So starting with something that you really enjoy teaching, something that really matters to you, that will infect your learners and resonate with them. And finally, what I'd like you to think about is the structure of our classroom, because this is sort of a basic area, a way that we can start to really encourage inquiry, just by setting up the seating arrangements, perhaps more into the tables, more into groups rather than in lines or rows, perhaps creating different areas where learners can go and sit and work together, if that's possible. It might be something as simple as, creating just an area, a very quiet area that has a quiet sort of display around it that encourages some quiet contemplation and quiet inquiry together. So just thinking about changing up the learning environment might be one of the first things that you might want to do, but start small and be kind to yourself, just take it one step at a time. It might be useful also to start with a question as a starting point. Thinking about the middle years program, we have many questions at the beginning that we'll place, but actually starting with a big overarching question might be something that will really sort of hook in your learners and give them an opportunity to ask more questions around that. And thinking about that summative assessment, whatever the assignment is at the end, thinking about how that will actually connect to that inquiry that we start off with, that big inquiry. So here is a model for inquiry. This is the one that Kath Murdoch uses, as you saw earlier in the video when she was talking about inquiry. She uses this 7-stage model where she talks about tuning in, preparing to find out, finding out, sorting out, going further, making connections, and taking action. Now, a model is a really useful thing, especially when you're first starting with inquiry, because it allows you and the students to think about the process and what questions might come at what point. But really, a model is only as useful as the unit that you're going to connect it with and your stages that you want to go through. So it might be very contextual, and you might want to take out some of these stages. They really just might not be appropriate for you. I know that we've got here in the middle years program, we've got this inquiry, action, reflection kind of process that we go through, and we can use that to really frame the inquiry and think about building formative and summative assessments that respond to that inquiry. So thinking about how this area here, the inquiry, will then feed into action, and how we then may have more questions and go back to inquiry, but also then continue that reflection process throughout the structured inquiry that we are doing. I love this little quote at the bottom here: be clear on why the river is flowing, where it's going, and how it will get there. So never losing sight of structured inquiry as being like a river that's flowing along, and it may meander left, it may meander right, but we always know where it's going and how it's going to get there. This is just a short video which just looks at some examples of how we can start to place some of that questioning and where we might put that in our written curriculum.
After the statement of inquiry has been finalized, you will move on to consider the inquiry questions that will help students inquire into the concepts, context, and the statement as a whole. There are 3 types of inquiry questions, and at least one question needs to be developed in each question category: factual, conceptual, debatable. Let's dig deeper into the characteristics of a unit's inquiry questions. All inquiry questions identified in this section of the unit plan should include at least one of the unit's concepts and/or the global context exploration, be transferable beyond the content of the unit, be open-ended, and allow for expanded exploration during the learning process. Now let's look at the characteristics of each question type. First, we'll consider factual questions. These questions encourage recall and comprehension. They lead to answers that are supported by evidence. Most often, factual questions begin with "what?" These questions might be used to explore the meaning of the concepts, context, or other terminology used in the statement of inquiry. As an example, we'll use the ideas for a design unit developed in previous videos. One possible factual question drawn from this statement of inquiry might be, what is innovation? Next, let's look at conceptual questions. They do not lead students to a particular viewpoint or answer. They encourage analysis and application. They could begin with how or why. These questions refer to at least one of the concepts included in the statement of inquiry and possibly the global context exploration. Again, using the example from design, a possible conceptual question drawn from the statement of inquiry might be, how are innovative ideas developed? Finally, let's look at debatable questions. These questions may be directly tied to the summative task or tasks. They encourage synthesis and evaluation. They require students to take a position and/or engage in discussion or debate. They may begin with could or to what extent. These questions refer to at least one of the concepts included in the statement of inquiry and possibly the global context exploration. Continuing with the example from design, a possible debatable question drawn from the statement of inquiry might be, to what extent do products and solutions need to be innovative to be successful? Remember that while you are required to have a minimum of at least one inquiry question for each category, you can also include more than one question in any category. Just make sure that each question is critical to understanding the statement of inquiry and can be fully explored during the time frame of the unit.
Okay, so thinking about our assignments and assessments, we need to think about the focus and the complexity and what justification there might be for that inquiry. We also think about needing to honour our student voice. Students are allowed to choose what they want to work with and to inquire into. And do we create assignments and assessments that allow students to really investigate their own questions aligned to that content? Remember, learning how to do inquiry is something that we need to build slowly. So I hope that you start small, build some structured inquiry and choose those steps to allow your students to start to ask those questions. Thank you so much for your time today. I know that we'll be collating some questions for me, so if you do have any, please feel free to share those. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.